I'm Mrs. Schertz, and this is topics 1.9, 1.10, 1.11 from the course and exam description for AP Environmental Science. We're going to discuss trophic levels, energy flow and the 10% rule, food chains, and food webs. All right, take a look at our first learning objective at the top here. So as we go through these learning objectives, fill in your study guides, fill in your notes, etc. Okay, so make sure that you understand that ecosystems have energy that flows through it. And this is going to be different than matter. So we just finished talking about our biogeochemical cycles, that is matter. So now we're talking about energy flow. So first of all, algae and plants and other producers produce energy. Consumers are also called heterotrophs. They obtain energy through eating or consuming or decomposing others. So we are consumers. Okay, so some organisms consume other organisms. So you have some names here. So herbivores eat only plants. They are known as primary consumers. And if you only eat meat, then you're a carnivore and you're considered a secondary consumer. If you're an omnivore, you can be either primary or secondary consumer. And so down here at this picture, you can see our producers are at the bottom of our trophic levels. Our second level is our primary consumers. Third level is a secondary consumer. Fourth level is going to be tertiary. And then we have our apex predator. And so our apex predators are the top of the trophic levels. And sometimes this particular trophic level pyramid shows 5 layers, but sometimes it's only 3. For example, with humans, we are apex predators, and it might be corn is our producer, and then cattle is our primary consumer, and then us, we eat hamburgers. We are the third level, which is a secondary consumer. So not all food webs, food chains, trophic level, energy pyramids, biomass pyramids, those are all things we're going to be talking about. Most of them have 3 levels, sometimes 2. For us as apex predators, if we eat plants, it's only 2 trophic levels. So having 5 is a little bit unusual. So really it's a food chain from the bottom to the top. And so there are some things that don't quite fit into our trophic levels either, and our decomposers, our scavengers, our detritivores are those things. So a scavenger is something like a vulture or even a coyote that will eat. Coyotes can function as scavengers, so they'll eat dead things like roadkill or other dead things and they'll also hunt as well. But our scavengers don't quite fit. They'll eat anything dead, so they don't quite fit in any category. Our detritivores are animals that decompose, so things like worms and beetles. And decomposers in general are mostly microorganisms like bacteria and fungi that will decompose and break down matter, and they don't quite fit in the trophic level, so we kind of usually put them off to the side. Okay, so energy and matter move through trophic levels. Matter is conserved, so we call that conservation of matter. But energy is lost. Now, energy is never really lost because energy can't be lost, but it's lost to the ecosystem as food because mostly it turns into heat. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so between each trophic level along a food chain, energy is lost, but matter is recycled. So keep that straight. So remember the first law of thermodynamics that you studied in a previous science class? So the first law says that energy is never destroyed, but it changes form. The second law states that when energy changes form, something called entropy, which is disorder or chaos, increases. So here's how we relate it to trophic levels. In ecosystems, as energy is used by an organism through their metabolism, most of the chemical energy changes into heat energy, which is not useful as food for the organisms that eat that organism. This is why it's lost, quote unquote, to the ecosystem as food. So that's why we say energy is lost, but matter is recycled. All right, so the amount of energy passed from one trophic level to another is called ecological efficiency. It averages at 10%. It doesn't have to be 10%. It could be 5, 20, etc. But it averages at 10%. So only 10% on average is passed to the next trophic level. The rest is lost as heat energy. If you feel your body, you feel warm. That's your food that you ate converted into mostly heat, and only 10% sticks to your body as biomass. Now, humans don't quite fit into this as well as other species do, but that's the general idea in terms of species and how they get their food. Most is lost as heat. 10% sticks to their body that can be eaten by another animal. Okay, so this rule, the 10% rule, can be demonstrated through a biomass pyramid, a numbers pyramid, and an energy pyramid, which all represent trophic levels. So this one is a trophic pyramid, really going to give you energy. So this would be joules of energy. And so really this should be proportion. This green box here is 10 times higher than the yellow box, which is 10 times higher than the aqua box here. And so in an ecosystem, there's a lot more producers than there are, or grasses we'll say, than there are zebras, than there are lions. So if you go on a safari in Africa, I've never been, that sounds super amazing, you're going to see a lot of grass. You're going to see more zebras than lions. You're going to see some zebras and very few lions, because there's so much energy that's lost in trophic levels that you can't support very many of your apex or top predators. Okay, so in the human diet, we are omnivores, which means we eat both plants and animals. Now, of course, some people are vegan or vegetarian, but humans in general can be omnivores. And so we can change between all kinds of trophic levels. If humans were to eat at a lower trophic level, like we eat a mostly plant-based diet, there would be less need for farmland, because if you take, let's say, the corn that's grown or the wheat that's grown, and you eat it yourself as a human versus giving it to a chicken or a cow or a pig to eat, well, when that pig eats that same amount of producer, that food, then it's going to lose most of that as heat in the pig's body. And so we've lost all that energy that could be eaten by humans. So it's much more ecologically efficient and better environmentally to eat at a lower trophic level as much as you can. Now, people who are vegans are going to eat entirely at a lower trophic level. And you can see again this next explanation right here. Food products like beef require a higher amount of farmland used for animal grazing due to energy lost between trophic levels. Okay, so a food web shows the interconnections between energy and matter in food webs. So, well, a food web really shows energy. If you have your matter there, matter is also moving, but the energy is not lost. So you can see that matter goes also with the arrows. But in a food web, you need to understand this part right here. So the most important thing to understand in a food web, because we're really mostly talking about energy in food webs. Energy points, arrows point the direction that energy flows. Now, you can remember it in that it points to the predator, but that is not an acceptable answer on the AP test. On an AP test, if you're asked, what do the arrows indicate? They indicate the direction of energy flow, and that's really important. Okay, another big thing you have to know is that all energy in ecosystems originates from the sun. Well, in most ecosystems, 99% of ecosystems. There are some ecosystems deep in the ocean on they do chemosynthesis on deep hydrothermal vents, but that's a rare exception. Everything else, the energy starts with the sun through photosynthesis. Okay, so food webs experience feedback loops. So you have to be able to describe on an AP test that if we took out, for example, the leopard frog, if we took that out, how would that impact other species. If the leopard frog died from diseases, then there's going to be more crickets, there's going to be less water snakes, which means there could be less bald eagles. So you have to look at what's eating it, what it's eating, to determine how these things are impacted. Now, if there's going to be a positive feedback loop, means something keeps going. So if we have less leopard frogs, the feedback is there's going to be less water snakes, less bald eagles. And so we call this a positive feedback loop. That it doesn't mean good or bad. Positive and negative feedback doesn't mean good or bad. It means positive means it's going in the same direction. Less leopard frogs, less water snakes, less bald eagles. However, there can be negative feedback loops, whereas if there's less leopard frogs, it means the crickets aren't all being eaten by the leopard frogs, so we have more crickets. That's a negative feedback loop because it reversed, and now we have more. So less leopard frog equals more crickets, so it's the opposite kind of thing. So you have to kind of be able to describe those types of interactions on an FRQ or a multiple choice question on your AP test. Okay, so again, here's another explanation of what I just said, and you have this diagram here that you have different types of feedback loops, and so pause the video, take a look at the descriptions here. You can also see more information about positive feedback loops, make the interactions go forward. Negative feedback loops make the interactions reverse, and so take a look, understand how this works. And you have positives, you have negatives in this system. And then here's another explanation here, feedback loops in a food web. So pause the video, take a look at this caption here to understand how these feedback loops work in trophic levels, in food webs, etc. And that's it for this topic. These topics.